the monstrous humanoid race that made up most of Morgoth's terrible armies. In more popular lore, they were the bulk of Sauron's forces crawling across the land of Middle-earth, carrying out his dirty work. But like any other monsters, what if the orcs were created against their will? J.R.R. Tolkien has revised the origins of orcs time and time again. In this marvelous video, we're going to dive into the origins of their race and their anatomy. Were the orcs created from the elements of the earth itself? Were they the result of ungodly breeding amongst men and goblins? Or did the Dark Lord Morgoth corrupt elves to create this monstrosity? Let's talk about all the origins that Tolkien never felt satisfied with. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Who are the orcs in Tolkien's lore? Tolkien continually revised the origins of the orcs race. Every time he felt dissatisfied with the story, he changed it. Fans of his work believed that the final origin he landed on suggested that they were corrupted elves. But this might not be entirely true. We'll soon explain how that works later in the video. In the first edition of The Book of Lost Tales, Tolkien described how exactly the Dark Lord Morgoth created the orcs. They were bred from the subterranean heat and slime created from the earth itself. It was said that their hearts were made of granite and their bodies horribly deformed. He also mentioned the Noldoli, the gnomes in the pre-canon, were corrupted by Morgoth and mixed in with the orcs. The Noldoli would become the Noldor, also known as the Elves of the Deep. This was closer to the orcs have just messed up elves theory that was considered canon by a considerable chunk of the fandom. In the second version of the Quenta Silmarillion, Tolkien mentioned the creation of orcs before the awakening of the elves. In his wretched fortress of Utumno, Morgoth created hordes of orcs, their hearts purely made of hatred. The orcs were made in a way to mock elves. Morgoth gave them their hideous appearances only in spite of their fairer counterparts. This was retconned when Tolkien claimed that only Eru Ilúvatar, the supreme being and creator of the universe, was capable of imbuing life into rational beings. Following this origin, it was said that after the awakening of the elves, Morgoth began sending corrupt spirits of Maiar among the elves, turning them over to his side. There existed a mysterious rider who would capture elves who strayed too far and brought them into Utumno. In the last 600 years of the First Age, Morgoth relentlessly bred armies of orcs in the bowels of Angbar. When the Noldor first arrived in the northwestern region of Middle-earth, the orcs were made to fight in the battles of Beleriand and Lamoth. They were overwhelmed by the elven forces, even when the House of Feanor confronted them. But when Feanor, king of the Noldor, was slain by the Balrogs, the orcs were free to breed into vast numbers. During the Third Battle of Beleriand, which was known as Dagor Aglareb, Morgoth's orcs were able to fight through the Pass of Sirion and Maglor's Gap, but were destroyed by the Noldor in East and West Beleriand. The appearance of the orcs in the Lord of the Rings universe. We've gotten realistic visuals of how the orcs look like in Peter Jackson's brilliant trilogies. Tolkien described the orcs as foul their faces, which smiled not, but their laugh that of the clash of metal, and to nothing were they more fain than to aid in the basest of the purposes of Morgoth. The humanoid race of ungodly beings was said to be made of hate itself. They were bred for only one purpose, to be the brute force of their Dark Lord and service his army. Why were orcs known to be so inherently hateful? It might be due to the way that they were bred by Morgoth. If we go by the corrupted elves' origin, or even the orcs were pre-existing beings captured by the Dark Lord origin theory, they were enslaved as their souls were worn away, turning them into savage beings. In appearance, the orcs were described to be stout with flat noses, sallow skin, and bow-legged. This description has stirred up some controversy in recent times. Orcs were relatively short, unless we're talking about the Uruk-hai variety, which was a mix of orcs and goblin men by the hands of Saruman. The orc chieftains that usually led Morgoth's and later Sauron's armies were said to be man-high. Regular orcs were nearly as tall as hobbits, which is why Frodo and Sam were able to make their way through Mordor disguised as orcs. Even the orcish armor and equipment were not beautiful to look at, but it was smartly functional. Many believed that the orcs represented industry and their tools were innovative. They were fascinated by engines, wheels, and explosions. They were also skilled at tunneling underground nearly as good as the dwarves were. If you think about it, the creation and tortured existence of the orcs was quite tragic. It was said that they deeply hated themselves, just as much as they hated their creator, Morgoth. The orcs, who lived in a constant state of chaos, knew only violence and war. Unlike other representations, Tolkien described the orcs as clever, being skilled smiths and craftsmen. Although orcish weapons were considered crude compared to the creations of the men and elves, they got the job done. The sorry nature of orcs meant they only existed in cruelty and wickedness, which they extended to nature. This was narrowed in during the Third Age, when the orcs gathered to serve Saruman the Wicked. They tore and burned down forests, building lumberjack camps for their preparations for war. In a lot of ways, the orcs were beyond help in their condition. Even the Uruk-hai were heavily brainwashed to loathe elves.
What do you smell? Man flesh.
History of orcs in the Lord of the Rings universe. The Dark Lord Sauron made a reappearance in the Second Age and created his realm of Mordor. When he began building his stronghold of Barad-dûr, Sauron employed the strength of the Northern Orcs, who were leaderless after the defeat of Morgoth. In the middle of the Second Age, the War of the Elves and Sauron broke out. Hordes of orcs were put on the battlefield but were severely defeated by the combined strength of the Elves and Númenóreans. Even after this defeat, their numbers grew and orcs were seen swarming the Grey Mountains. The first defeat of Sauron was partly because of the lack of support from the Eastern Orcs. These orcs were a menace to the dwarves and men of the Eastern lands. They were pushed into forming the alliance of dwarves and men to protect their people from the pillaging orcs. Initially, the Eastern Orcs didn't take Sauron too seriously, seeing him as a being in his fair form. Later, he visited them in his true form and lured them over to the dark side. This was how he slowly rebuilt his might and kept the orcs under his control until his fall in the Third Age. In the Third Age, the orcs remained the main backbone of Sauron's armies in Mordor and Dol Guldur. Sauron's henchmen, the Witch King of Angmar and Saruman the White, used the orcs to run their filthy operations against the free peoples of Middle-earth. The orcs were led by the Witch King in his crusade against the realm of Arnor. After this, they were commanded to invade Eriador under the leadership of Sauron. After the War of the Last Alliance of Men and Elves, Sauron momentarily retreated into the shadows. The autonomous society of orcs in the Misty Mountains was led by their chieftain, Azog, in the War of the Dwarves and Orcs. Years after the Battle of the Five Armies, the orcs were gathered during the War of the Ring. The wizard Saruman committed crimes against nature and made ungodly crossbreeds, the Uruk-hai, who were a mix between orcs and goblin men. The orcs of Mordor gathered to fight in the Battle of Pelennor Fields and the Battle of the Morannon, which was fought at the Black Gate near the end of the Great War. The orcs of Dol Guldur lurked in Mirkwood until the fall of the fortress, which was one of the last battles fought during the War of the Ring. Near the end of the Third Age and the beginning of the Fourth Age, their numbers had significantly dwindled. Most orcs had perished in war or failed to breed effectively. They still roamed the underground as a persistent pest which was incapable of going extinct. However, their power had diminished without a puppeteer to lead them. Who are the most notorious orc leaders and warriors in Tolkien's lore? The orcs were nothing without a strong-headed leader. The armies of Morgoth, Sauron, and Saruman were often led by a chosen commander or general. One even led the independent band of orcs from the Misty Mountains. The Orc Lord, Azog, led a siege of terror against the dwarves. His origins are hazy, but his first appearance was connected to King Thror's expedition to reclaim the lost realm of Khazad-dûm. The king was confronted by the Great Pale Orc, who beheaded him and carved his name in runes on his dismembered head. Azog the Defiler claimed that he now ruled the kingdom of Moria after brutally killing the king. To add insult to injury, Azog's minions, the orcs, hacked away at the king's body, feeding the pieces to the crows. This infuriated Thror's son, Thrain II, who gathered all 7 houses of the dwarves and sought revenge, thus marking the beginning of the War of the Dwarves and Orcs. The final battle of Azanul-Bizar took place before the gates of Moria, where Azog was hunted down and beheaded by Dain II. But the orcs had slain many of the dwarves, who, in turn, couldn't reclaim the kingdom. Dain saw the Balrog Dorin's Bane in the mines, which sent even the orcs scattering. After Azog's demise, the torch was passed on to his offspring, another terrible beast known as Bolg. Although their numbers were greatly diminished, Bolg reigned over the orcs and goblins of the Misty Mountains. The remaining orcs, after the fierce battle, had taken refuge in Mount Gundabad. After a whole century passed, Bolg led the forces of orcs, goblins, and warg riders into the Battle of the Five Armies. Going by the book's lore, Bolg was crushed to death by Beorn, the Skin Changer. Beorn had avenged Thorin Oakenshield, who had succumbed to his grave wounds. In Peter Jackson's film canon, Azog had survived the War of Dwarves and Orcs. Instead, he was summoned to Dol Guldur to become the commander of Sauron's armies. Bolg was then made in charge of hunting Thorin and company. Bolg and his pack of orcs chased after them in Mirkwood and attacked Bard's family in Laketown. During the Battle of the Five Armies, Bolg had brutally killed Thorin's nephew, Kili. His death was avenged by Legolas, who swung up to the orc's shoulders and stabbed him through his skull. This elf knew how to kill his enemies in style. Meanwhile, Thorin Oakenshield and Azog fought till death tore them apart. Like father, like son, both orc chieftains were cruel and merciless killers. Azog's preferred style of combat had always been riding atop his white warg, while his son was lightning fast and extremely agile. Both these orcs were excellent leaders and war strategists. Another feared orc leader was Gothmog, the lieutenant of Morgul. It is said that Gothmog, the lieutenant of the White Witch, was originally from Minas Morgul, the spectre of the Nazgul city. His most notable appearance was during the Battle of Pelennor Fields, when he stepped up after the White King of Angmar was killed. He drew out the reserves of his armies from Osgiliath and led the forces of the Southrons, Easterlings, Variags, and Trollmen. His most well-known appearance was in Peter Jackson's Return of the King, in which he was the leader of the Orcs of the Eye. He first commandeered the forces of orcs crossing the Anduin River moments before the Battle of Osgiliath. While the surviving troops of Gondor retreated, one of the Ithilien rangers, Madril, was brutally speared to death by Gothmog. When Faramir and his men rode out to try and reclaim Osgiliath, Gothmog ordered his archers to fire a volley which killed and maimed the Gondorians. Gothmog was particularly sadistic, as he ordered the heads of the dead soldiers from Osgiliath to be catapulted into the heart of Gondor. How can we forget the moment when a large piece of debris was launched right at him? Gothmog moved away at the last second and spat on the piece of stone, unbothered. In the end, he was killed by a combined attack by Aragorn and Gimli. Lastly, we have Grishnak, the orc captain, who led a band of Mordor orcs accompanying the Uruk-hai in transporting Merry and Pippin to Isengard. Grishnak's intention for the two hobbits conflicted with Ugluk, the captain of the Uruk-hai. Both the parties were given clear orders to deliver the halflings, unharmed and unspoiled. Somehow this orc knew about the One Ring and firmly believed that Merry or Pippin had it in their possession. While the Uruks and orcs were attacked by Eomer's band of horsemen, Grishnak slipped away and tried to kill the hobbits. He was caught and killed just in time by a rider of Rohan. In Peter Jackson's The Two Towers, Grishnak's role is reduced to wanting to eat the two hobbits. He threatened to put a maggot hole in their bellies. Are orcs truly corrupted elves or something else? Let's explore the elven origins of the orcs in more detail. Did Tolkien rest on this story of how the orcs indeed came to be? Combining information from The Lord of the Rings and the collection of his notes in the Silmarillion, we can piece together an answer, even though the author himself never seemed fully satisfied with the orcs' origin story. To put it simply, we can say that the orcs were once elves. It was noted that the Dark Lord Morgoth captured elves that strayed too far from the safety of their realms. He then enslaved, tortured, and corrupted them into the mindless beasts that we know as orcs. This differs from the first three possible origins of the orcs we spoke about earlier, but Tolkien decided to establish the fact that only Eru Ilúvatar, the supreme creator of his universe, was capable of creating sentient life. This took away Morgoth's ability to create orcs in mockery of the children of Ilúvatar. So he resorted to capturing them instead and worked his dark, twisted magic on their souls. He turned spirits of the Maiar into Balrogs and elves, along with men into orcs. During the Year of the Trees, the awakening of the elves occurred. The first elves awoke under the bright starlight in a place that came to be known as the Bay of Cuiviénen. Morgoth's servants infiltrated their peace and began abducting them. The elves were dragged to Angbar, the Dark Lord's dreaded fortress in the far north, where they were tortured in unspeakable ways and mutilated until their souls died away. Morgoth had committed unforgivable sins against the children of Ilúvatar, for which he was severely punished by the Valar and gods of Arda. They imprisoned him in Valinor for his crimes, but the deed had been done. The orcs were left to fester and breed in the depths of his fortress. It was just as Frodo had claimed. The shadow that bred them can only mock. It cannot make not real new things of its own. He doesn't think it gave life to the orcs. It only ruined and twisted them. Morgoth wasn't capable of tainting a whole race, but a few captured members. Taking a closer look at the orcs at your own risk. The only feature they share with elves is their pointed ears. If we give this thought, the origins of orcs as corrupted elves added a lot more depth to the overarching theme of good versus evil. It fits into the religious parallel of Tolkien's lore, with elves being portrayed as pure beings of light, while the orcs were their demonic counterparts. We must remember that Tolkien never settled on one definitive origin for the orcs. He went as far as claiming that there was an elvish strain in orcs, but some groups were corrupt men. Some were instinct-driven animals trained to fight in battle, and some even were descendants of the fallen spirits of the Maiar. Are orcs' lifespans shorter than humans? Are they immortal? When it comes to the question of their lifespans, it was firmly established that orcs are indeed mortal, regardless of what origin story you consider to be truest. We can also say that the first generation of corrupted elves who were turned into orcs may have remained immortal, but this didn't pass down to subsequent generations of orcs as the remaining elven blood in them was bred out. In one of his essays, Tolkien clarified that orcs were susceptible to disease like any other living creature. They required food and rest and needed to train for battle as well. They could be killed during battle, but unlike elves, They didn't go to the halls of Mandos in Aman for an afterlife. In fact, it was never stated that orcs had souls. It was also said that the lifespan of an orc was shorter compared to an average Númenórean. The mortal orcs lived till they were 50 to 60 years of age. But if we're talking about the corrupted spirits of the Maiar who served Morgoth, they were known to be immortal. Many of the Tolkien fandom don't think the corrupted elves theory stands true, so we also take it with a grain of salt. Can they reproduce? One characteristic of the orcs was that they never died out completely. After the first generation of orcs came into existence, they bred underground sufficiently enough to create armies. Tolkien never explicitly described how the orcs reproduced, but it was considered that they reproduced sexually like all mammals. Yeah, orc women exist, but were never spoken about, as orcs were mostly referred to by their entire race. Orcs perpetuated their kind just like humankind did. In the books, we don't really get to see how the orcs existed in Mordor. Their living infrastructure was never really described. However, when Frodo and Sam are making their way through Mordor, they wonder where the orcs live, but soon realize that the part of Mordor they're in is mostly ruined or run down. Surely, orc settlements could be found deep underground in Mordor, the Misty Mountains, Utumno, Angmar, and the Forodwaith Mountains. There exists a theory that talks about how female orcs were mostly used for just one purpose. As a race, orcs might have only focused on producing the strongest, most cunning and agile offspring to serve their Dark Lord's armies. Also, the mud pit thing is also movie conventions. Orcs didn't really emerge from mud pits, as shown in Peter Jackson's trilogy. We see Saruman pull out a perfected Uruk from his wizard cauldron, but surely this wasn't the way he built his entire army. It's possible that he used these mud sacks to mutate the first few prototype orcs and use them to breed generation after generation. How powerful are orcs? Strength and durability. Speaking of the entire race of the orcs, they were known to be mighty beings who also found strength in their number. Mostly bred for battle, the orcs had an inbuilt tendency for violence and often relied on their brute force during combat. If we were to compare the strength of elves, dwarves, and men stripped of their magical power, then the dwarves would be the strongest, followed by the elves and then men. Even though ordinary orcs were of a smaller stature, they could still compare with the stronger men. Through extensive and relentless training, an orc could be as strong as the dwarves, but this strength was different for each orc. We've already spoken about the great orcs like Azog, Bolg, and the captain of the Uruk-hai, Ugluk, standing tall and could overpower their enemies with their intimidating size. There's also a possibility of their race functioning through the Alpha Orc method of choosing the strongest, most brutal orc to lead their armies. In the Second Age, when Sauron gathered the scattered numbers of the orcs to rebuild his forces, he favored a select few. The strength, intelligence, and overall power of these chosen ones might have been enhanced by dark sorcery and magic. Tolkien described this as rekindling their hateful hearts, and to some Sauron showed favor and fed them lavishly. Following Sauron's defeat, Isildur and his band of Númenóreans, who were at least 7 feet tall, were torn down by a group of 2,000 orcs. Even Lady Galadriel chose her finest, strongest warriors to stand against the orcs of the Eye. The orcs weren't oblivious to their own strength, like the Eastern orcs laughing at Sauron, believing the notion of serving him to be ridiculous. Why are they sensitive to sunlight? Why have the orcs always festered and bred underground? Why do they recoil from sunlight? And why would the hills of Moria be swarmed with orcs only by nightfall? The answer lies in the nature of their creation. The race of the orcs was created in the deep, dark bowels of Morgoth's fortress. In fact, they made them during a time when the light of the world had been shadowed. This relates back to the first sources of light in Tolkien's world, which were 2 enormous lamps in Middle-earth. These were Illuin, the silver light of the north, and Ormal, the golden lamp of the south. This was around the same time when Morgoth carved Utumno deep underground and far north where the light of Illuin couldn't touch them. So when he first began corrupting life into orcs, they were born into nothing but darkness. As the menace that Morgoth was, he destroyed the 2 lamps, blanketing the world in even more darkness. With his return to Middle-earth, after his imprisonment, Morgoth realized that the 2 trees of Valinor didn't enlighten this land. So he continued creating creatures of the night, firmly believing that he would reign over Middle-earth and keep it drowned in darkness. The first rising of the sun was agonizing for the orcs, who instantly retreated under the surface of the earth. Even the Ent, Treebeard, spoke to Merry and Pippin about this possibility, claiming that it is a mark of evil things that came in the great darkness that they cannot abide the sun. But Saruman's orcs can endure it even if they hate it. Evidence of this could be seen in the 2 towers when the Uruk-hai marched in broad daylight on the orders of their masters. Do orcs have night vision? After all these ages of living underground, the orcs must have had night vision, a power that their creator had to imbue in them. Sadly, this was hardly the case, as Morgoth didn't even consider their need for vision in the dark. Many believe that he was a poor bioengineer who set up his own creations with shortcomings. Why would he create trolls just for them to turn into stone when the sun rose? Similarly, even though the orcs spent most of their time underground and were vulnerable to sunlight, they still needed flame torches to navigate their tunnels under the surface of Middle-earth. Out of all the living races of Tolkien's lore, the elves had the keenest senses. They had sharp hearing and sight compared to men. Even the hobbits were said to have a good eye and awareness of their surroundings. The orcs didn't possess these abilities to such an extent. Of course, there were orcs who were skilled at particular activities, like hunting. One such tracker could be seen in Mordor, trying to sniff out Frodo and Sam like a bloodhound. Some orcs were bred specifically for such purposes, but they were never blessed with natural night vision while being creatures of the night. Orcs in other adaptations. Let's talk about the depiction of orcs throughout all the Lord of the Rings adaptations. Ralph Bakshi's 1978 animated film titled The Lord of the Rings covered the stories of the Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers. The orcs in this movie were nightmare fuel, to say the least. They were demonic-looking beasts with crimson eyes, fangs, clawed hands and feet, which were covered in thick black fur. They were seen wearing robes instead of armor and Viking-style helmets. Their unsettling appearance can be attributed to the rotoscope style of animation that the film was made. It was drawn over live-action footage, which makes all the imagery of the orcs quite disturbing. Then we have Rankin Bass's 1980 animated feature, The Return of the King. The orcs in this film were voiced by Paul Frees and looked more like oversized grey frogs than the terrifying monsters that they're meant to be. Now, Peter Jackson's LOTR trilogy was where things got truly impressive. To say that the book descriptions of the orcs were given justice would be an understatement. We got a diverse array of orcs in these films. We've got Azog and Bolg, both of whom have very distinct personalities and appearances that set them apart from their minions. We have deformed, war-torn orcs like Gothmog, who instilled terror in their foes. Orcs like Grishnak were perhaps the best representation, with their rotting skin and snarling faces. In both of Peter Jackson's trilogies, orcs were seen wearing different types of armor depending on where they were from. For instance, the Uruk-hai had a special set of battle armor branded by Saruman's White Hand. One orc of Mordor even sported a skull on top of his helmet. Apart from their physical appearance and mental capabilities, these movies gave the orcs more than enough personality to keep us watching. Their anger could be understood. Wouldn't you be frustrated if you had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days? Marvellous verdicts. Here are all the questions you had about orcs answered. Most of them might want to feast on hobbit flesh or wipe out the race of men altogether. However, the fact remains that the nature of their creation was a tragedy. Many have raised the questions of whether the orcs can ever be seen as redeemable. Do they have capacity for redemption? Well, the author who wove them out of his imagination doesn't believe so. They were meant to be a malevolent race of monsters. After all, there's no light without the darkness. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.